Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here in Helsinki and to speak on this theme of science and theology, whether this is all about conflict or mutual enrichment. And I think given the high profiles that both science and religion occupy in contemporary cultural debates, it's one of the most culturally significant and, I think, intellectually engaging themes of our age.
Sorry, could you speak a bit closer?
So, to continue, what I want to argue in this lecture is that we need a big picture. And what I mean by that is something that is not simply intellectually opportunist, but something that doesn't just bring things together, but something that allows them to speak to each other, to engage each other. And it seems to me this allows us to begin to appreciate the nature and limits or benefits of their interaction. And one of the things that comes out very clearly from many contemporary psychological studies is that there is growing interest in this idea of what I'm going to describe as a big picture, by which I mean a way of seeing things that tries to frame and to hold together the elements of our experience and our observation. It's very important psychologically because it brings a sense of stability and coherence to life and thought. And of course, this is an integral aspect of the Christian faith. You'll all know that the New Testament speaks of the mind of Christ, which is a pattern of thinking about the life and the world, which is disclosed in Jesus Christ as God incarnate. And from the outset, Christian theologians realized the potential of their faith to generate and to sustain a greater vision of life. And we see this very well articulated in the writings of C.S. Lewis, who declared that his Christian faith allowed him to make sense of every other aspect of his rational and imaginative life, including, of course, the natural sciences. So let's begin by thinking about science. I want to say that science seems to me to be one of humanity's most significant and most deeply satisfying achievements. And when I was young, I was given a microscope by one of my relatives who worked in the pathology department of one of Ireland's leading hospitals. And this microscope became a gateway to a new world. And as I happily explored the world of small plants and cells that I found in pond water through my microscope's lenses, I developed a love of nature, which remains with me to this day. And it convinced me I wanted to be a scientist. And you know, I never regretted that decision. At high school, I focused on physics, chemistry, and mathematics. I won a scholarship to Oxford University to study chemistry, where I specialized in quantum theory. And then I went on to do doctoral research in molecular biophysics, looking at ways of studying cell membranes. And I still, to this day, have that microscope in my study, which is a reminder of the pivotal role it played in my life. But though I loved science as a young man, I had to come to terms with the fact that it wasn't complete. Science helped me understand how things worked, but what did they mean? Science gave me a neat answer to the question of how I came to be in the world, but it seemed unable to answer a rather deeper question, which is, why was I here? What was the point of life? And for reasons I'll explore a little bit in this lecture, more thoroughly tomorrow, I came to the view that science and religious faith offered us partial but complementary insights into a greater reality. Each was capable of filling in part of this bigger picture I mentioned, but only part. We need more than that to give us the bigger picture. Now, let me tell you about a point that Albert Einstein made in a landmark lecture on science and religion in 1939. He began by noting that until quite recently it was held, and I quote, that there was an irreconcilable conflict between knowledge and belief. And Einstein went on to challenge this. He pointed out that convictions can indeed best be supported with experience and clear thinking. He was very clear, evidence really does matter. But he then made this remarkable statement, which I will read very slowly because it is so important. Those convictions, he wrote, which are necessary and determinant for our conduct and judgments, cannot be found solely along this solid scientific way. Einstein insisted that the natural sciences were outstanding in their sphere of competence. Yet he warned us, and again I quote from him, and these words are very interesting. The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. And you and I both know that human beings need more than a purely rational conception of our existence that science is able to offer. And Einstein's point is that while science is wonderful, there are areas of life that science does not illuminate, but which we need illumination for. This means that we need to open up such fundamental questions as meaning and value, and it makes us realize that science is unable to answer these questions. And that is not about falling into irrationality. It's simply about realizing the limits of the scientific method. And again, I quote from Einstein. Listen to this. Objective knowledge provides us with powerful instruments for the achievements of certain ends. But the ultimate goal itself and the longing to reach it must come from another source. Now, I think that's a very important statement. For Einstein, science was incomplete. It needed supplementation, and that was not about degeneration into irrationality. And that, of course, is where Einstein saw religion playing a significant role. And I think he's right. But I imagine many of you this afternoon will say, well, that's all very well, but aren't science and religion in conflict? After all, that is the dominant media narrative of our day. And I want to begin to engage this. It seems to me the cultural establishment of our age is still locked into a science versus religion mindset, and is encouraged by the rhetoric of new atheist writers like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, who insist not simply that science makes belief in God unnecessary, but that it makes it impossible. Now, I think on that basis, for Dennett, for Dawkins, no rational person could ever embrace religion. Science is always going to win, and anybody who's got an interest in religion is outdated and probably deranged. Someone like myself, who sees them, when rightly understood, as having the potential to mutually enrich, is dismissed simply as mad or bad or sad, and possibly all three. But I'm going to argue this afternoon that this science versus religion narrative may be dominant, but it is outdated and it is wrong. It's sustained not by the weight of historical evidence, but merely by its endless uncritical repetition, which studiously avoids the scholarship of the last generation, which has undermined its plausibility. When we lay these historical myths to rest, it's clear that there is a plurality of narratives for understanding the relation of science and faith, none of which have been the privilege of being self-evidently true or evidentially normative. The relationship between science and religion is complicated, and it cannot be reduced to dumbed-down slogans which ultimately serve polemical cultural agendas. Yes, of course, science and religion can be in conflict, but they don't need to be, and in fact usually haven't been in the past. The problem is both that our culture tends to look both at our history and our present experience through this controlling lens and sees what it wants to see. Now, it's certainly true that science, if it is to be science and not something else, is committed to a research method that's often styled methodological naturalism. That's the way science works. It has established a set of tested and reliable rules by which it investigates reality, and methodological naturalism is one of them. But this is not about limiting reality to what can be explored in this way. It's about setting rules for exploring reality, not determining what reality is. It doesn't mean for one moment that science is committed to some form of philosophical materialism. Eugene Scott, who was director of the National Center for Science Education, once wrote these words: "Science neither denies nor opposes the supernatural. It simply ignores the supernatural for methodological reasons. It's non-theistic, not anti-theistic." Now, I need to say here that some, but I think I must say only some scientists, present science as being intrinsically atheist, and certainly I would have believed that myself when I was an atheist and a scientist in the past. But I think we might raise the question as to whether this belief on their part primarily arises from their atheism rather than their science. Because virtually all my colleagues who are both scientists and atheists would have no time for this myth, and it is a myth, that science entails atheism. The great intellectual virtue of science is its radical openness. And it seems to me that dictating that science has to be atheistic is simply a dogmatic imposition on the scientific worldview. And we all owe it to science to prevent it from stuff like that. In recent years, a solid body of scholarship has built up which forces revision of these older understandings of the conflict between science and religion. And my point is simply this: why do we in the 21st century have to keep on using this late 19th century myth of the relationship of science and religion? We can do better than this. Scholarship has done better than this, but it has not filtered down through the media to ordinary people. The warfare of science and religion myth has had its day, and it's time to move on. Now, I know it's endlessly repeated. We find it, for example, in Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, one of the standard works of the New Atheism. And in this work, we find Hitchens using what I would describe as a highly selective, even cherry-picking attitude towards history to make his unsustainable point that science and religion are necessarily in conflict. He gives one example to show up this utter opposition of religion to science. He makes the point that Timothy Dwight, who died in 1811, who was a well-known American religious leader, opposed smallpox vaccination, and then makes the point this shows how utterly useless and pointless religious people are. Now, I want to make the point, he's right. Timothy Dwight did oppose smallpox vaccination, but you cannot just have one fact in isolation, as if that one fact on its own determines the big picture. Let me give you two more facts which, puzzlingly, Hitchens forgets to mention. The leading American theologian, Jonathan Edwards, who was president of Princeton, wanted to persuade his students at Princeton that smallpox vaccination was safe. Edwards died in 1758, and he died because he asked to be inoculated against smallpox to show his students it was safe. That doesn't fit Hitchens' narrative, and you can see why it's airbrushed out of the picture. But much more interestingly is another example which dates from the 20th century, and that is the very interesting case of George Bernard Shaw, one of England's leading atheists, who in the 20th century argued that smallpox vaccination was a fraud. He wrote that it was a delusion, a filthy piece of witchcraft, and dismissed leading scientists whose work supported it, like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, as charlatans who knew nothing about science. Now, many of you here this afternoon will say, well, why didn't Hitchens mention these other two examples? A religious figure who supported smallpox vaccination and died for it, and an atheist who opposed smallpox vaccination in the 20th century. The answer is simple. He wants to sustain his narrative and is not letting facts get in his way. Now, the point I want to make is this lingers. And I'll give you an example. Here is one, taken from the New York Times in the last 10 years. When 19th century doctors began using chloroform to alleviate the pain of childbirth, the Scottish Calvinist Church declared it a satanic invention intended to frustrate the Lord's design. Now, it's a wonderful story and it's highly amusing, but it's a complete fabrication. It has no historical basis. It's lifted straight from Andrew White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, published in 1896, which is known to simply invent its facts to suit its narrative. Any modern study of this historical episode will make the point that, first of all, no such interventions took place from the pulpit, and secondly, that the main opposition to chloroform in the Scottish academic community came from scientists who believed it might damage the fetus as it was about to be born. So it seems to me there is a need to revise things in a very big way. Now, I'll give you an example which actually helps us understand this point better. As many of you will know, there's been a massive rethink since the Second World War about our universe. If we were here in Helsinki 100 years ago and we were talking about the origins of the universe, I think you all know that the view then was, well, there was no origin. The universe has always been here. There have been some local variations in energy distribution, but that's about it. But of course, since the Second World War, there's been massive accumulation of evidence that the universe must be said to have had a beginning, to have had an origination. And that, of course, is an intriguing idea because it seems awfully close to what Christianity was saying. And as you may know, some scientists who were atheists became very alarmed at this. For example, Fred Hoyle, a well-known atheist cosmologist, said, "This sounds too religious for me." Or Steven Weinberg, who many of you will have heard of, said, look, he much preferred Hoyle's steady state model of the universe because it was much easier to reconcile with his atheism. And in a lecture of 1967, he remarked, and I quote from him, "The steady state theory is philosophically the most attractive theory because it least resembles the account given in Genesis." He then added, very reluctantly, "It's a pity that the steady state theory is contradicted by experiment." So what I'm saying to you is, look, there is this lingering myth. I say lingering because it's very influential, but it is unreliable, it's outdated, and really we need to move on. And what I'm saying to you is, look, you have heard Richard Dawkins' narrative about the relation of science and faith. It's out of date, it's evidentially underdetermined, and what I'm proposing this afternoon is a different way of looking at things. And what I want to do now is move on and look at two leading themes which seem to me to emerge in any creative, constructive, informed engagement between science and Christian theology. And I'm going to flag up two themes that seem to me to be of major importance. The theme of intelligibility on the one hand and coherence on the other. And these seem to me to be a very, very useful way of opening up this question. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis that many of you will know. It's from the end of a lecture he gave at Oxford in the 1940s, in which he tries to summarize in a single sentence what it is that drew him to Christianity and what it is that keeps him a Christian. This is his answer. "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And those I want to suggest to you are very powerful words. They're engraved on Lewis's memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. They are a very good summary of his thought. And what Lewis is saying is that Christianity gives us a way of looking at things which resonates with the way things actually are. It's an inductive approach. It says we take the theory, we look at experience and observation, and we note the resonance, the chiming in, the congruence between the theory and the observation. My own time as a scientist impressed on me how much science depends on being able to investigate a universe that is both rationally transparent and imaginatively beautiful. And it seems to me that the Christian framework gives you a way of understanding both the way the world is and the way we are as thinking creatures able to investigate the way the world is. And this, I think, is very important. One of the most significant parallels between the natural sciences and Christian theology is a fundamental conviction that the world is characterized by regularity and by intelligibility. There's something strange about the world itself and the human mind, which allows the patterned regularity within nature to be discerned, represented, and understood. Now, this seems to me to be important. How are we able to account for the regularity of nature? Why is nature actually intelligible to us? And you might think of that very famous quote from Albert Einstein, the eternal mystery of the world is its explicability, its Verstehbarkeit. Why can we make so much sense of it? Christianity gives you a framework which actually makes that puzzle just seem the sort of thing that you might expect. So what I'm suggesting to you is that one of the things that Christian theology does is to make both the success and motivations of the natural sciences intelligible. Michael Polanyi, a scientist I think many of you will have read, talks about the purpose of science being to discover, I quote, the hidden reality underlying the facts of nature. In other words, it's not simply about observation. It's trying to understand and discern the bigger picture that lies behind that. And it seems to me that's a very important point that needs to be made. John Polkinghorne is a very good example of a physicist turned theologian who has found his theology to illuminate his science. And Polkinghorne talks about there being, again I quote, a congruence between our minds and the universe, between the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without. And his point is that a theistic metaphysics gives you a lens which allows you to see the world, to see humanity in a certain way that actually makes this the sort of thing that you would expect. Now, there are many examples of this that I could give, but I want to point out that the theme of intelligibility is important. Intelligibility is about giving you a way of looking at things which makes you say, that makes sense. If it goes beyond reason, it doesn't contradict reason. One of the points I'd like to emphasize this afternoon is that you can only prove shallow truths, but the really deep truths about meaning and purpose and value lie beyond the ability of reason to disclose fully and unambiguously. And in many ways, the kind of approach that C.S. Lewis and John Polkinghorne are developing is to say that science and theology, in effect, both witness to the limits of reason. We need to reach beyond reason. And the key point for me is that science is very, very good at filling in part of this big picture of reality. But because we are human beings who think deep questions, those questions that Karl Popper referred to as ultimate questions, we need answers that go beyond simply rational functionality and give us existential answers to who we are as human beings. So intelligibility is important, but alongside that is the idea of coherence. Christianity, it seems to me, provides a web of meaning, a deep belief in the fundamental interconnectedness of things. It's a difficult idea to grasp, so perhaps this analogy may help. I want you to imagine you're standing on top of a mountain and you're looking down on a patchwork of villages, fields, streams, and forests. And you might take your camera and take a snapshot of the village, the stream, the forest, perhaps the mountains. And that lets us see that there is a big picture. And one of the points I want to make is this. Christianity gives us this big picture, this panoramic shot, which allows us to position that snapshot of the village, that snapshot of the woods, that snapshot of the streams, and let you see they are all part of that same picture, that they all belong together. That's not as if there is this aspect of reality which has no connection to everything else. They all are held together within a framework of meaning. And that seems to me to be a point that we need to emphasize. Our modern age, as many of you will know, has seen the emergence of significant doubts about the coherence of reality. You can see this even in the 17th century, where radical philosophies, in effect, questioned whether the world made any sense at all. But in the New Testament, we find a theme which I think is very important here. In Colossians 1, we read that all things hang together or are knit together in Christ. It's a wonderful way of thinking. And it's a point that's picked up by C.S. Lewis. In one of his early writings, C.S. Lewis he's talking about Dante, but he's making a more general point. He says that if you have the kind of vision of the world that Dante had, which is nourished and informed by a rich Christian vision of reality, then this gives you a way of imagining the world which holds everything together in a satisfying and meaningful way. And Lewis argues that Dante reflects, and I quote, a unity of the highest order, precisely because, again I quote, it copes with the greatest diversity of subordinated detail. The point that Lewis is trying to make is that a good vision of reality, a good big picture, is able to give you a way of looking at nature which seems to bring things into focus, to let you see things more crisply and clearly than you might otherwise do. You might think of Christianity being like a lens which brings things into focus. You might look at something through a different lens, as I once looked at the world through my atheist lens, and it seems fuzzy and out of focus. But Christianity brings these things into focus. Christianity has always insisted there's a hidden web of meaning and interconnectedness between the seemingly incoherent world that we experience. And you know, this matters to people. They want there to be some sort of coherence. Doesn't make it right, makes it very human all the same. Some of you may think of the atheist novelist Virginia Woolf, who experienced short stabbing instances of almost like illumination. She called them moments of being, in which, and this is a quote from Virginia Woolf, she seemed to see some real thing behind appearance, as if a curtain was drawn aside briefly and she suddenly saw things that she otherwise could not. And many of us, I think that that is important. And Christianity, I think, gives us this fundamental reassurance of the coherence of reality, that however fragmented our world of experience may seem, there is a half-glimpsed bigger picture which holds things together. Now, clearly, this is not a new idea. Those of you who have studied patristic theology or the theology of the Middle Ages will know that these ideas were once dominant. And we have, I think, lost sight of something here. I think that there's a real concern in culture at large about whether we've lost a sense of the fundamental interconnectedness of things. I see this in a very interesting essay by the German poet and novelist Hermann Hesse, who in a very famous essay of 1927, the height of the Weimar Republic, in effect described his sense of despair at the complete chaos of thought of his time. He said that German thought at that time was, I quote, a mere aggregation of intellectual fashions and the transitory values of the day. Again, a mere aggregation of intellectual fashions and the transitory values of the day. His question was, can we recover something deeper? He wasn't sure, but he recognized there was an issue there. So how does this relate to science? Well, as I've stressed, science is good, it's really good, at taking things apart so we can see how they work. But I want to suggest to you that the Christian faith puts things back together again so that we can see what they mean. And a religious perspective on this doesn't in any way deny the scientific utility of this kind of approach, but it does challenge its finality. Science is great, but it's also incomplete. And because you and I are human beings, we are going to want to try and fill in the areas of that big picture which go beyond scientific functionality. And what I'm talking to you about this afternoon is not negating, denying, or anything science. It's about respecting and affirming it, but also noting its limits, and noting also that each of us are human beings who feel we need more if we're going to lead meaningful lives. And you know, scientists are human beings, and that means they are going to wonder about those questions that their science isn't able to answer. So the question then is, how can we begin to think about ways in which science and Christian theology might interact with each other, respecting their distinct identities, but at the same time seeing them as having this capacity to engage and to enrich? The philosopher Mary Midgley is someone I'm going to talk about in a moment. And Midgley is a well-known philosopher who is very concerned about the links between science and broader culture, the importance of affirming the role of science, while at the same time realizing it does have its limits. And she argues that our world is so complex, it's so rich, that we require, I quote, many maps, many windows, if we're going to be able to do justice to the richness of reality and human experience. If we don't, we simply reduce reality, whereas we need to respect reality and find ways of coping with it. So this is the analogy that Mary Midgley gives. She asks us to think of an aquarium, a great big tank full of fish, pond life, plants, very, very complex. So she asked us to imagine a really big aquarium. And our task is to give a description of it. Here's what she writes. We cannot see it as a whole from above. So we peer is an English word that means look in a sort of hesitant way, at it through a number of small windows. We can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shall not get very far. Now, I think you can see the point she's making. She is saying there are different perspectives on reality. Reality is complex. It's like a very rich landscape or a very complex building. You see it in one way from one angle, in another way from another angle. The way to get the complete picture is to gather together and integrate the insights from different perspectives. And Mary Midgley's point is that this is a way of understanding the relationship between science and philosophy and theology. Science has its own perspectives, and that's great. But there are other, like colors on an artist's palette. And these enable to give us that rich, textured, colored vision of reality, which no one single angle of approach is able to give. Midgley also makes the point that it's not just about perspectives, it's about the research tools you use. Because every research tool we develop is adapted to a particular problem. This is what Midgley writes. For most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. I think that's right. And I think you can see how this immediately begins to relate to the questions we're looking at this afternoon. We're looking at ways of trying to hold together science and theology, respecting their distinct identities, but saying, in effect, they can offer different perspectives which enrich our vision and understanding of a hugely complex reality. And I want to suggest to you that this multiple perspectives model is actually very helpful. It's the first way I encountered of thinking about this when I transitioned from atheism to Christianity and tried to work out how on earth I could relate my faith in Christianity to my love for the natural sciences. And this began to give me an answer. But I want to say to you that it's not enough. We need more than this. So what I need to do, I think, is begin to open up a second approach, which is not so much about multiple perspectives, though those are good, but rather is about multiple levels. Multiple levels. Those of you who are scientists will be very familiar with this way of thinking. It means that for a complex reality, which you're trying to explain, you have to approach it at a number of different levels. The classic example of this was given by the geologist Frank Rhodes back in the 1960s, and he asks us to imagine a kettle that is boiling on a gas ring. And he asks this question: why is the kettle boiling? And he says, I can give several answers. Here's a scientific answer. The gas is burning, it's converting energy into heat, and the heat is conveyed to the water, which reaches boiling point. Now, those of you scientists would say we need a much longer answer than that, but I'm watching the clock, and that's the best you're going to get this afternoon. But it is a perfectly good answer. But Rhodes then said, but actually, there's another reason. I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Very English. My question to you is this. Both those answers are right. Does the fact that the first is right make the second wrong or inadequate? Does the fact that the second is right make the first wrong or incomplete? The answer is simply this. We need both those answers to give a full picture of why that kettle is boiling. There are multiple levels to this question, and that is the relation that I want to explore for a few moments in the rest of this lecture. I want to, in particular, use the idea of multiple levels of reality to show you how we need these multiple levels of explanation, and also why what we sometimes call scientism, namely that science can answer all questions, is simply unreliable. So I'm going to give you a scientific example. I'm going to look at the World Health Organization's categorization of disabilities. I'm doing this because it's a very accessible example, but it allows me to make some points very, very clearly. What does that word disability mean? And the World Health Organization recognized it's complex. It involves a number of levels. One of them is pathology. There is something happening within the human body which means that the function of some organ is changed. But that's only part of the picture, because this leads to impairment, which means that the bodily organ which no longer functions properly means that something we normally do, we can't do as well as we used to, which means that it leads to a change in our patterns of activity and also a change in the way in which we engage with other people and our environment. And the World Health Organization's point is very simply this. To talk about disability is to talk about all of these things which are all part of the same picture, and they all need to be seen as a significant element of disability. Now, I think that is a very important theme, but here is the point I want to make. Supposing we take the example of someone who has a brain tumor. In other words, we're looking at pathology. Here's my question. How would you investigate that? What research method would you use to investigate whether there's a brain tumor, how big it is, where it is? You might give me several answers. The answer I would give is I would use positron emission tomography. Look at the second one, impairment. If you have a brain tumor, your cognitive functions are impaired, how would you measure that? Would you use positron emission tomography? Well, no, you wouldn't, because it just doesn't do that. You would use one of these cognitive tests, like the WAIST test. And likewise with all of these things, each level demands its own distinct research methodology. Ontology determines epistemology. The way things are shapes the way we investigate them. And a research method that works perfectly well at one level is useless at others. And you can see where I am taking this. The point I want to make, and I think it's a very important point, is that science is great in its own domain. The fact that science works so well in telling us, for example, why the planet Mercury seems to behave in slightly anomalous ways, doesn't work all that well in telling us what the meaning of life is. Is that a criticism of science? No, of course not. It's simply saying that science works so well because it's limited and focused. And to investigate other questions, we need different research methodologies. Science answers questions at one level, theology at a different level. They're part of the same picture. Now, if Richard Dawkins were here, he would make this point, which I'm going to respect but then disagree with. He would say, if there is a scientific explanation, the scientific explanation is always going to trump alternatives. I want to say, I know what he means, but what he's really saying is that a scientific explanation is valid in its own terms, but there'll be other levels of explanation that need to be brought into the picture. For example, look what I'm doing. I'm pointing at our distinguished chairman. You might say, right, give me an explanation of what's going on here. And you could give a very good physiological explanation of muscle contraction, which led to my finger moving in this direction. But that doesn't tell you why I'm pointing my finger, which is to just point out this very gracious gentleman who's introduced me so well. Both those answers are right. They're both part of a bigger picture, but on their own, they're inadequate. And that basically is the approach that I'm laying out this afternoon. I'm arguing that science is great, and I'm not in any way critiquing it. I love it. I'm just saying it fills in part of a big picture, and we need more than that if we're going to live as human beings. And theology fills in other parts of that picture. So that seems to me to be a very important approach. So what is my own approach? Well, really, the word enrichment seems to me to be the key theme. Richard Dawkins talks about warfare between science and faith. I concede entirely that science and faith can find themselves in conflict, but I want to say that isn't always the case. And bear in mind, we live in a postmodern world where there is no essentially determined normative relationship between science and faith. There's a sense in which we decide that for ourselves. What I'm saying to you is that I believe naturally, and I certainly believe as a matter of policy, we can get science and theology to talk to each other and lead to an enrichment of narratives. Now that, I think, brings us to a very important point. This is John Dewey, a well-known American philosopher, basically wrestling with what he thought was going wrong with American culture in the late 1940s. And this is his diagnosis of the situation. The deepest problem of modern life, he writes, is our collective and individual failure to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose. In other words, how the world functions, what ought to be right, what is meaning, what's value, what's purpose. And Dewey is saying, look, the way our culture is going, these are being forced apart. And we are dealing with professional communities that only look about how we understand the world, and those who reflect about how we ought to behave, what the meaning of life is. And he's saying we need to bring these back together. And that seems to me to be a point that we can talk about more. I think Dewey is right. And I think that the kind of approach I'm suggesting to you, this idea of the enrichment of narratives, might open a way of doing this. So what I think I need to do is to give you an example, to try and help you see how, in effect, Christianity gives you this way of looking at things which begins to transform the way we look at the world. The Greek word theoria, which lies behind our word theoria, really means a beholding, a way of looking at. And so what I'm saying is, what way of seeing reality is given us by, well, for example, atheism and the Christian faith. I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm just going to talk about one very big change I noticed in transitioning from atheism to Christianity. I'm going to put a slide on the screen which may not project as well as I'd like, but here it is. It's the belt of Orion. Orion is a constellation. The belt is these 3 stars. And I'm just going to talk about looking at those when I was an atheist, looking at those when I became a Christian. When I was an atheist, I loved the night sky. I built myself a little telescope to try and understand it, and I'd often look at the stars, in one sense appreciating their beauty, but also feeling a sense of being overwhelmed, being despondent, being melancholy, because they spoke to me of my own transience and the complete meaninglessness of the world. Let me try and explain what I mean. I knew that those 3 stars in the middle of our picture were a long way away. And my thought was, the light that's now leaving those stars will take hundreds of years to reach Earth. In effect, I was looking at the stars as they were hundreds of years ago. A kind of time travel. But the thought that was dominant in my mind is this: by the time the light that's now leaving those stars reaches Earth, I'll be dead. And so these stars were a solemn, stark reminder of human transience. And I was then an atheist, and my atheism gave me no framework of purpose or meaning. And I was bold in those days. I said, right, so atheism says there is no meaning, no purpose. Well, I'm brave, I'm bold, I can cope with that. But nevertheless, it was an unsettling thought. And it seemed to me that my atheist way of looking at things just didn't answer that question. Now, that's only one example. There are many others I could give, but I know there are many others who feel the same way. There's a quote from Ursula Goodenough, an American cell biologist, who talks about her own existential response to realizing that one day the universe would come to an end. And she talks about being overwhelmed with terror at this thought. She just could not cope with this thought and the implications for herself and for any philosophy of life. And so this is an extract from her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature. Some of you will have read this. This is towards the beginning of the book, where she talks about her just sense of despair, which arose from looking at the night sky. The night sky was ruined. I would never be able to look at it again. I wept into my pillow, the long, slow tears of adolescent despair. A bleak emptiness overtook me whenever I thought about what was really going out in the cosmos or deep in the atom. So I did my best not to think about such things. So she had a way of looking at things which led her in certain directions, and I would say didn't really make her a happy bunny. But when I discovered Christianity, it gave me a framework of meaning, not simply for helping me make sense of the world, suddenly realizing that science fitted in, that there was a religious motivation for doing science, there was a religious explanation for why science was so successful. These were important things, but also meant that I looked at these questions through a different lens. And so I would read, for example, Psalm 8. And many of you will know this, very powerful. It's in effect talking about this sense of insignificance we have, and yet counterbalancing that with this deep thought that we matter individually in the sight of God. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? But you know how that psalm goes on. Yet you care for us. And that's a very important insight. Many of you will know the very famous photograph taken from the space probe Voyager in 1990. As you know, it was heading towards the outer limits of the solar system, and Carl Sagan persuaded NASA not to photograph where it was going, but to photograph where it was coming from. And you may know that very famous photograph of the pale blue dot. I would show it to you, except the screen would be completely black, except for one pixel, which you'd probably not see, which was pale blue. And Sagan's point was very simple. That little blue dot is where we live, and it matters a lot to us. But, he says, it's a pale blue dot, a lonely speck, he writes, in the great enveloping cosmic dark. And the point is that the Christian faith gives you this framework that recognizes that concern and responds to it. So I think I need to begin to wrap up this lecture. There's a lot that I could say. I want to make it absolutely clear that the approach I'm developing in this lecture is not about merging science and religion. No, I don't blur the distinctions. I'm absolutely clear. There is science, there is theology. They are different, but they can talk to each other. And I believe that that conversation can be positive and enriching. At times it may be challenging, and that might be good for both parties. But the conversation, I think, does need to happen. I think that there is real need on everyone's part to move beyond this outdated conflict narrative, which is essentially, when all is said and done, a social construction invented to serve the needs and agendas of certain social group. But I want to emphasize this is an historical contingency which we can change. We can choose how we see these things. And the point I'm trying to make is that we need to go back to older, to better models, such as those we find in the Renaissance, which in effect talk about the two books of nature, the book of nature itself and the Christian tradition, which both help us to read the other. There's a possibility of enrichment, and that is what I am suggesting in this lecture. The point I'm making is that we all need a richer narrative to make sense of this world and our lives, especially weaving together both our understanding of this world and our grasp of meaning and value and purpose. And the point I'm emphasizing is that reality is simply too rich to be grasped by any angle of approach, by any specific research method. Again, think of positron emission tomography. Great for one thing, not much good for anything else, but you use it where it works, and you draw on other methods to investigate other aspects of reality. That's the point I'm making. What I'm suggesting to you in closing is simply this. That quote from C.S. Lewis, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else, is in effect asking us to imagine Christian theology as a kind of illuminating lens, which both makes the landscape clearer and enables us to see further. Now, I'm not for one moment saying you see everything clearly. Again, to stick with C.S. Lewis, there are shadowlands, there are areas of obscurity. But the idea of the sun rising and illuminating a landscape seems to me to be very, very helpful as a metaphor of making sense of our world. So that's why I'm suggesting we need both a robust theology and an informed science to make sense of this world. We need, if we are to live authentic and meaningful lives as human beings, to have the best picture possible of ourselves and the world, and that means bringing together the insights we find in different disciplines, the sciences and theology being the example we're using this afternoon. There will be boundary disputes. I want to make that point absolutely clear. But the principle is there. There's a possibility that taken together, these can enrich our vision of this life and give us this more full picture than we could gather simply from one to the other. I've tried to do this in this lecture, but there is a lot more that needs to be said. But I hope you'll have caught at least something of the picture I've been trying to develop. So it just remains for me to thank you so much for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you.